Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about beginner mistakes in sword fighting. So I'll be talking about experience I've got from what's called Historical European Martial Arts, or HEMA for short, but can apply outside of it as well. And the example I've got here is a Langsax I forged. It's an example of a one-handed sword, but the stuff that I'm talking about is fairly universal and not only can apply to different designs of swords, but can even apply outside of swords with other weapons in close combat as well. So that aside, let's get started. So one of the first things that is a serious problem with people who are new to this sort of thing is they tend not to plan ahead. So let's say they'll commit to a certain action exclusively, so they won't be prepared if it goes wrong, or even what they're going to do afterwards if it's actually going kind of right. So if you have someone who is more experienced, they might, for example, let's say I put my sword in front of me, so this is to kind of create a bit of a threat, just sort of there in a neutral sort of position. Even in things like military saber, people naturally end up in this sort of posture, or something like this. These are called inside and outside guard, for example. But you can see sometimes people threatening with the point forwards in various styles as well outside of that. And what you can do is you can look at options like trying to bind up with the sword and control an attack from there. You could perhaps beat the sword aside and then follow up after that. You know, there are various options that you can do. But one of the things that I find beginners do is they don't really consider all of the options. They don't consider how to keep going and going and going with new ideas. So they might have an idea. Here's the sword in front. Okay, I'm going to beat that sword aside. Wham! And I'm going to maybe hit the person afterwards. This is not in itself a bad idea, but what might happen is, for example, a person like myself likes to make a bit of a hilarious mistake out of these people and also purposefully teach them out of such bad habits by, let's say, putting a sword point forward, and then they'll think, I know, I'll swing really hard and beat that sword aside. And then what I'll do is dip the sword point, thrust, or even dip the sword point, cut. Simple as that. So what happens to them is they swing very hard and then flail off into the sunset. And in the meantime, I just simply disengage the sword, so they've gone from they're going to beat me aside down to swish. They've cut at the air. And then I'm ready immediately with just a simple movement of the hand. This isn't something that requires a lot of preparation. It's just a simple disengage, thrust, disengage, cut, whatever. And in that time, they've swung past. I do whatever the hell I want, get out of there before they realise what happened. The reason this happens is because they haven't planned ahead. So you need to think. Let's say you are going to beat a sword aside. You might want to think about, what am I going to do if I've beaten a sword aside? Can I then immediately go for them? Might they recover quickly? That sort of thing. Or perhaps, what if it doesn't work? Let's say you do swing at the sword, and then instead of beating it aside, you miss. Now, if a beginner is swinging really hard and focusing every ounce of effort into just beating that sword aside, they're not ready for anything afterwards. Even if it works, let's say I did that and I didn't react in time, and they beat the sword aside. I can still have some time, a second or two later, where I recover, and they'll have a time a second or two later when they recover. What's the result? Neither of us have had anything in particular happen. All that's happened is they swung at my weapon has been temporarily beaten aside, I've recovered, they've recovered. It's a stalemate. There's nothing happening. Whereas what can happen at the worst, like I said, is they predict this is going to happen, adapt, and then go in for the kill. Whereas what a beginner or someone more experienced should do is perhaps they're going to do what is necessary for something like that beat, but they should be ready, like for example where I'm talking about the thrust there. So let's say I wanted to beat that sword aside, and then whoops, it doesn't work. They've done this. So what I could do is, instead of swinging very hard, and I'm not ready at all, I could swing hard enough, so something like this hard is more than enough. If you whacked someone in this sort of front half, there's so much leverage, I could go whoosh, just with that much effort, that's enough to make them go whoosh, come off the side for as long as I need. If it fails, I haven't completely flung myself away, I'm still ready for something afterwards. So we go back to that example again. The defender is thinking, he's going to beat the sword, I'm going to dip the point, he swings at the air, I come in and thrust. That example yet again. So what happens is swing, dip, and then as they're coming in for the thrust, because I've only swung this far rather than completely across, I'm ready for that thrust, parry, and now I'm ready. The difference being I haven't committed so much, put every ounce of effort into that first step, that one action, the sort of single time commitment, that I'm actually ready for stuff that happens afterwards. And same kind of thing again. Let's say they're expecting to be beat, and then they'll turn that momentum into a cut. So then I beat the sword aside, I was going to do something, but oh, actually, now I need to make an emergency parry. It's that situation. I'm the attacker doing that beat. I'm planning, well, I'll beat them aside, cut at them. And then suddenly, I beat them aside, actually I need to parry that, then cut them. It's that kind of thing where you're ready to adapt more steps ahead. You don't need to make all sorts of complicated, detailed plans. Again, I'm trying to keep this really simple. But you need to be doing actions where, whatever the outcome, you're ready for what comes next. Whether you are successful in an idea, or whether you're unsuccessful in the idea. So it's just that idea of not putting everything into one thing, like that beat, or whatever action. It could well be you're going to cut the legs, or it could be you're going to stab. There are all sorts of things. Again, I'm talking in a general concept here. Whatever it is you're planning to do, don't put everything into it, because if it works, great, but you need to be ready to follow up. If it doesn't work, you really need to be ready for what they're going to do as a, as a retaliation. So with that, similarly, that follows up to another problem that beginners have, which is being too aggressive or too defensive. Now, if a person is too aggressive, the problem is it becomes very suicidal. They will, I found, even quite beginner types of people can hit a person quite frequently, potentially. But what happens is, with that suicidal attitude, unless we're talking about some of the old rules they had with, I think it was Olympic fencing and things, where if you hit a person a 60th of a second before the other person, you score a point and you win, all this fist pumping to convince the judges, yes, I won. You throw it out of the window, because in reality, if two people, let's say, stab at each other at the same time, the end result is two people have been seriously injured or killed, or, two people have not scored, or whatever you're aiming for. It's a bad result. It's not, as we like to call, martially viable, to just essentially commit suicide on the other person's blade while attacking them, unless you genuinely wish to die, in which case I'm sure there are nicer ways to off yourself. So instead, it should be balanced with a degree of caution. Yes, if you see an opportunity, an opening, some sort of thing that you could do, yeah, you can go for it. I'm not saying be terrified of those opportunities, but make sure, again, kind of similar to that first thing I said about not committing too far to one action, but even if you are getting the idea of doing multiple actions, like lots of attacks all over the place, don't commit entirely just to inflicting injuries on them, because you need to worry about keeping yourself safe as well. So instead of just attacking, and then, oh, you're getting injured while perhaps injuring them. You instead do it in a way that you keep yourself safe as well, or at least as safe as you can. In reality, there's only so much you can do, and yes, there are still going to be opportunities to get hit, but if you're not being completely suicidal, you can at least keep yourself reasonably safe. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's being too defensive. If you're, and this is a problem that I can sometimes fall into at times, particularly against especially skilled opponents. You know, people are very fast and able to keep me on the back foot. The thing is, if you are only defending, even if you have a near perfect defense, if you're not giving a threat to the opponent, in itself it actually worsens your ability to defend yourself. Because if you have, let's say you're parrying a lot, so people are trying to attack, 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 and you're going parry, 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 all of this, getting all of these things ready, but you're not actually threatening them, they can keep going and going and going until eventually you get hit. I mean, even if in some magical fantasy world you could keep the fight up for about 4 hours straight, eventually they're going to find purchase and hit you. Whereas in real life, that usually lasts for maybe a handful of hits at best, usually perhaps up to your third or fourth attack. By the time they've started attacking, your defense begins to collapse. And it's usually that if you've parried once, you can do it quite well. On your second one, not quite as well. By your third one, it's becoming quite desperate. And by your fourth one, you're lucky to barely manage it. And there's pretty much impossible to manage something like a fifth, unless you're doing it really skillfully. And again, part of that doing the defense really skillfully is providing a threat. If I am taking my threat away, even if I can defend myself really well, the opponent is going to feel encouraged, and they can try things, they can experiment, they can do whatever they want, and then do all of that. Whereas, if you're providing a threat, even if it's just a recovery and you're trying something and it fails and they parry, just that threat in and of itself makes your defense better by the threat, and it sort of puts them on the back foot instead of just you recoiling. It's a good strategy. So that's just a couple of ideas, and yeah, I mean, to summarise that point, they say the best defence is a good offence, the best offence is a good defence. Mix it up, a bit of both is good. And I've got a plumber who's just about to arrive, so I shall cut that here and say toodaloo.